It had indeed been a most unusual experience for someone like me, because I would normally never step on ice, and yet it seemed I had done just that. Indeed, it had been one of the worst periods of my life, wasting time with someone believing himself to be the only authority to command everybody as he pleased. In those very vulnerable times, I was listening to some trusted friend's advice to consider the opportunity which might lead to a positive outcome. It would have been far better if I had listened to the warning signals. It was obvious that many of Damon's associates were taking advantage of him, seemingly accepting all his dictates for reasons known only to them. Remember, he was wealthy. He might thus have considered me as yet another candidate to command and lord it over. On the other hand, he did not know any better, for it was his way of helping others. I've seen him treat people like elements of life unworthy to do business with, for they were dishonest towards his imagined greatness, himself being overly elite, highly intelligent, and having plenty of buying power. But let us also remember that the fragrance always stays in the hand that gives the rose. It is like giving, yet demanding its immediate return. When I was a youth, I was subjected to so many promises, especially by those who also considered themselves as God's chosen, and the witnesses, preaching about righteousness before the end times. Although befriended with them, for they apparently sought peace in the world, I could not correlate this with their biased viewpoints. Perhaps I was very young and inexperienced. My relatives and some friends thought that I was following their teachings due to my association with them. In fact, I was seeking ways to escape from a lifelong situation which was likely to develop. I am grateful for their unexpected and generous help in accommodating me when I traveled to Germany, primarily to educate myself and work at the same time. That was where I met my future partner, whom I loved so dearly, and who, shortly after, got baptized into her divine associate's faith. It was extremely hard to follow the norm and endless restrictions they adhered to. Frankly, I could not understand the logic behind not celebrating socially accepted and beautiful events which the world enjoyed, such as Christmas and birthdays, nor could I accept their rejection of life-giving treatments to their loved ones and children in hospital. Were they meant to become sacrificial offerings? I tried hard to understand them, but studying medicine at one of the prominent universities in Europe showed me more important truths, highlighting that their way could be no more than a utopian or even cultist idealism. I left Turkey because I was no longer able to tolerate the bullying, undermining, and belittling attitudes of the locals against the race I belonged to. Despite all the desires of my father and some other relatives, I could not see any future for myself in that country. After thorough research, discovery, and wise advice from those who had suffered much during the 1915s and had ever since been considered as unworthy individuals, even to be called human, all opportunities denied for any of them to excel, it left me no other choice. Incredibly, during an interview in regard to a possible conscription service, as expected of their citizens, a high-ranking military officer made mention of this condition, advising me to make use of the opportunities overseas to educate myself. Even then, when I was still a mere youth, I decided not to follow the crowd. Alan Ashley Pitt writes, "The man who follows the crowd will usually get no further than the crowd. The man who walks alone is likely to find himself in places no one has ever been." When I decided never to return to that country, it was because of my inability to accept people's attitude towards me and others for being Armenian, let alone the embarrassment one had to endure. I was an odd man out. To be able to live there reasonably comfortably, as it had been the case for many decades, an Armenian needed to change his identity, his belief, and live a life of lies. Even today, after such drastic changes, they still live in fear of being discovered as to what they originally are, for fear of ridicule, persecution, and endless punishments born of historic hatred. They are seen as unwanted criminals, just for being Armenians. I simply had enough of being laughed at as if I belonged to an extraterrestrial alien race. Alas, after leaving their homeland, I was not able to see my parents throughout the ensuing years, not even when they grew old and passed on. Life had taken me into different directions. I got married, had children, and created a life for myself in Australia, where I have not been discriminated against as a member of some minority group, but accepted as someone who belonged to the human race. I am an Australian citizen. The other language I was able to speak during my childhood days is long forgotten, and only fragments are remembered. After the divorce from my ex-partner, who still follows the pathways of the only righteous ones she believes in and the chosen, I could never wish what I experienced happen to any human being. This unacceptable adventure I had undertaken with Damon had been one of the most devastating experiences to endure. As one can appreciate, I desperately needed a long while on my own to rediscover and to reinvent myself. Euripides, the great thinker, once declared, "Along with success comes a reputation for wisdom." Damon spoke of success all the time, but wisdom was absent. After all the ugly times I had experienced with him, I ardently wished that he would leave me alone for a considerable time, and forever would be even better. Knowing his nature well by now, I became extremely apprehensive in answering incoming phone calls, the same as opening my door when someone knocked. I was living in fear. It was an unusual and very strange sense of worry I could do without. This meant that I preferred people to leave messages so that I could respond to them in my own time. However, when Damon returned about a week later, he could not wait until he called me with his usual rough and threatening mannerisms, remembering that I had clearly told him that I needed at least a month to relax my mind. I avoided responding to his demands. I was also aware of his relentless characteristics of never respecting such a request. Was it due to him considering himself to be the most special individual, charming, intelligent, and wealthy? During this time, I was still conducting tailored meditation sessions at some friend's dwelling. Although he had attended some of those programs previously, he could never relax, always fidgeting with his hands, occasionally puffing. He was always bored when subjected to relaxation meditations. Remaining still was most certainly impossible for him, even when it required just 20 minutes of his time. As he later complained, those minutes were like hell and very boring. He preferred to relax with his other associates, smoking his herbs and gossiping about things. Obviously, the experience of meditation was too unusual for him. Later, he said that he did not feel comfortable with those old people around him. Yet they were not very old at all. He repeatedly told me to get rid of all those old arseholes and start a new meditation group with his chosen friends and associates. His aim was to make lots of money through those sessions. He continually bitterly complained about my outgoing messages, where I ended my words with, "Smile and be happy." His last 2 messages were particularly interesting, because he was again threatening me. "Professore, we must meet very, very soon, or otherwise things will go very nasty." I knew how angry he was when things did not go his way, and his eyes looked as if he was an outraged primitive with murderous intentions. One could not be certain whether he was bluffing or was very serious. To tell you the truth, I could not interpret his behavior any other way. Nearly 3 weeks later, while I was conducting one of my regular meditation sessions at Doreen and Jerry's, I had to endure yet another frantic episode of Damon's personal ills. That evening, after we had finished the session, and while enjoying light snacks, 2 members of the group immediately rushed in after being outside briefly, warning us to hide Suren, or whisk him away from behind their dwelling, for they had seen Damon parked in his Mercedes and putting a gun in his pocket. Joan asked me to get into her car quickly, and we left. The next morning, the friends who were initially gathered there told me all about the last night's incident. They had noticed him parked on the roadside and seen the gun he was carrying. Probably he had obtained it when visiting Los Angeles. When he drew up to the close, he approached Rosemary, who was sitting in her car, insistently demanding to see Suren, and she told him that I had left. Rosemary explained later that when she asked him why he so urgently wanted to see Suren, he told her, while pulling one of his lower eyelids and asking her to look deep into his eyes, according to his traditions, to indicate he was not bluffing, that he came to kill him. When Joan was driving in a hurry, she told me to hide quickly, for Damon was driving next to her at one stage. In truth, I had never experienced something like this before, and was petrified. The next day, Rosemary and I furnished a legal document for the police to obtain a restriction order to be served on Damon, so that by law he could not disturb me any longer. He dared not approach me directly or by phone. Many weeks passed without him bothering any of us. Just as I was thinking that he might have got the point, he was on the phone, somewhat calmed, asking me to meet him. Apprehensively at first, I asked him, point blank, whether he wanted to kill me. "No, Professore, I didn't mean it that way. I only wanted to say I was very serious about our friendship, like brothers, you know," was his response. I could never trust anybody with such primitive behavior, and told him what I thought, explaining that I set my own rules and was not obliged to meet him. Therefore, I needed some time before I was ready to consider his request. A short while later, over the phone, one could hear him say he regretted his bullying behavior, promising that this sort of thing would never happen again. But even if I decided to meet him, I could no longer trust him. Taking note of his promises and believing that there may be some human aspect of good which could be found in his person, I decided to see him at one of the Chapel Street restaurants in Prahran. But I was going to see him only with another friend and possibly in police presence. Again, Rosemary volunteered to accompany me. I was told that I should not be so compassionate, but my courage was commendable in deciding to go and see a man who had threatened to kill me. When having met him at Café Siena, talking about his usual concerns and personal issues, Rosemary decided to leave us alone for a short while. We had a light meal, which he decided to pay for, and told me how frightened he was when the police delivered the restriction order to his address. He was frightened, for he did not want to be found guilty for what he possessed. After discovering that I was not so easily broken, he exclaimed that I had the balls of steel. I told him about how I felt in regard to his bullying and threats. Even the mildest occurrence of such kind would mean he would never be able to see me again. Noticing I was not frightened of him at all, he changed his story a little, telling me how frustrated he was not seeing me for such a long time, but he just wanted to scare me a little at the time, and now he knew it would not work with me. He was apparently very serious with his alleged generous friendship, without any strings attached. That was most certainly not believable, as far as I was concerned. Then he exclaimed how sad he felt that I lived in Springvale, in that awful state, in an awful place. He was going to get me a house somewhere in St. Kilda, and I could pay him whenever I had some income, slowly but regularly. At the end of the day, the house would become mine. He even asked me if I wanted to live at my previous dwelling, which I had to sell to survive once, but I did not want to live with unwanted memories of the past. He demanded that I should decide very soon, if possible, then and there. I clearly told him that I needed to think about it, although I knew he was not happy with this. When I left him and went home with Rosemary, she told me that if she had known what kind of man he was, she would most certainly have attempted to stop me going overseas with him, for she noticed how I looked when discovering that I was to travel with him, like a lamb going to the slaughter. Joan suggested, in regard to what Damon was intending to do, one would not know what good could come out of it. Since Damon was probably a changed man, she advised me to accept his offer, although Rosemary was against it. I had no one to turn to. Joan, with her family, and Rosemary were the only people I could talk to about anything, including my dilemmas. They were the only people who listened to what I said and cared about me as a human being. According to Joan and her family's philosophical viewpoints, I had nothing to lose. Maybe I should have completed that sentence with, "except my life." We started a meditation program at Damon's place for his personal spiritual needs, wherein he expected me to do some private channeling to his spirit friends and guides who were allegedly helping him with his financial success. He rarely invited his other associates and bitterly complained about Rosemary being a little too forthright for his liking. Speaking liberally about this issue, he often exclaimed how frightened he was when the police delivered the restriction order on him. He obviously had a number of reasons to feel that way, while advising me to get rid of all those arseholes, sharing my meditation activities so that we could start a brand new one with his own associates. On occasions, whenever we traveled together, he pointed at certain people on Chapel Street, talking about their gang-related self-employment issues. They had apparently been jailed unnecessarily and were now released to enjoy their freedom with whatever they wanted to do. He often asked me about what I thought this subject, expecting me to agree with him that they had to make money somehow to survive. I told him exactly what he wanted to hear. Everybody needs to do something to earn their money. Without realizing my psychological assessment of the situation, responding according to his needs, pleased him immensely. He was very happy, saying, "Aha, this is my professore." Despite everything, I remained a mystery man to him. Finally, he purchased one half of a house in East St. Kilda, originally belonging to a Jewish family, at number 1, 315 Orong Road, on the corner of Dean's Avenue. It was built in a Blue Belt area and was a great investment property, an old Victorian double-brick building. When questioned, he told others that he was buying it for his sister and brother-in-law when they decided to settle in Australia. But to me, he constantly said that it was just for me, and closer to his address in Caulfield. This was occurring during a time of desperation on my part. It was indeed a time I wished nobody within the human race would suffer. A time of having no food after paying all my expenses while living at number 2, 40 Lewis Street in Springvale. This situation was unfortunately forced upon me whilst also attending a business course at the Holmesglen Institute of TAFE, as on 29th of May, 1997, under a NEIS coordinator, Mr. Len Alabaster, who was in opposition to my idea of producing fractal movies, especially after seeing a sample footage, which he shared with his family. He exclaimed that his wife had been seeing devils and other frightening characters in there. Possibly his religious ideals and viewpoints also interfered with his mindset, thus his apprehension in regard to his negative influence on the so-called authority, which was likely to grant funding for my business enterprise. I considered the whole affair as being naught else other than wasting time on empty promises and dreams. On the other hand, I was constantly encouraged by certain friends to accept Damon's generous offer for rehousing myself in East St. Kilda. Although extremely fatigued, feeling lost and vulnerable, I decided to try my luck, which had not been very friendly lately. Either it would work well, or I would need to rehouse myself. According to Joan, if I did not try it, I might blame myself forever, although I could no longer trust anybody after what I had experienced. Moving out from Springvale might provide me with an ever-needed and renewed hope to recreate myself. I moved in with my old furniture, bedding, and household goods, my wonderful red tabby, and all my memories. At first Damon did not want me to make any holes on the walls, but soon after he put hooks on them to hang my paintings and drawings. Seeing me pour a drink from a big bottle of Chivas Regal I had obtained while in the United States, he considered me extremely addicted to alcohol, like his brother-in-law. At this time he was making many enquiries, asking my assistance in furnishing an official letter from a psychologist's viewpoint on why a family reunion was important for his sister and family to migrate to Australia. They found accommodation nearby, while his sister looked for a sports-related training position, whereas his brother-in-law was to manage one of Damon's petrol stations. However, his sister was furious that the house in East St. Kilda was not occupied by her and her family, but by somebody like Suren, whom they did not know. There were times when Damon incessantly kept interrogating me if I was taking advantage of him, as they had no idea about my background, although enough had been said. Obviously, his own background did not leave any room for considering that I was an honest person. His limited thoughts were based upon his experience of being surrounded by people who made use of him, hence his forever doubting nature. As time went by, he appeared to calm down slightly. Unusually, Damon wanted to attend lectures, as with Stanton Friedman, the nuclear physicist, at the Dallas Brooks Hall, and my lectures on discoveries in regard to early civilizations, the beginnings of current humanity, Sumerians, Mesopotamians, and the Hittites. I remember when I was lecturing at the Theosophical Society's auditorium, and there was a huge crowd of people, all wanting to hear me speak. Damon sat right in the front. Jamay, my other longtime friend, was seated behind him, and later told me discreetly that Damon was sapping my energies while I was on stage. Margaret had also attended that lecture, and had a little unpleasantness with Rosemary, using a few ungainly expletives at her. She was angry with women who stood between her and men she was interested in. Later, she asked her young female relative to visit me at my East St. Kilda dwelling, and after discovering what looked like above-average wealth on my part, without knowing the details, pursued her interest in wanting to live with me and be married. She also hoped that I would purchase the rest of the house to accommodate her. She could not understand that this was nothing more than an unfulfillable dream. She started calling me day and night again, pestering about why I chose to accommodate Rosemary instead. For, after all, she was blooming English. She hoped, as she declared, that I would hate the English, just like some of the Irish did. Soon after my visit to Sydney and meeting her over an evening meal at a quality restaurant, she asked me to become her attorney when she went to the States to see her nursing sister and mother, who were now living there. She kept exclaiming that my eyes looked like the famed Indian guru Sai Baba's, and was convinced that we shared the same spiritual advancement. Obviously, she was encouraged to love Sai Baba unconditionally, interpreting it as being in love with him. Since she could never live with him, it became too much to contend with. Needing to make a clean break from it all, for it was very likely to develop into yet another unpleasantness, I told her that this issue was no more than a bunch of lies, and I did not want to have anything to do with this any more. She was very disappointed. She still insisted that I had encouraged her to leave her profession as a teacher at the high school in Sydney, where she was going to be forced into medical redundancy, and that I was apparently going to look after her in marriage. Although she was not going to let go so easily, she said, "All right, this is all bullshit. But when are we going to meet, and when do you think we should get married?" Now I had yet another dilemma to deal with. I needed to be able to generate sufficient income to pay my new expenses. Damon, however, was completely against my applying for any type of government assistance, for he wanted to have nothing to do with the authority, and suggested he was going to pay me wages if we started a meditation group in my then dwelling for his associates, promising that this way he was going to make me very, very rich, beyond my wildest dreams. But the excessive pressure from his sister was growing also. Soon after, he was questioning me whether I had any hidden agendas, and was bitterly opposed to my suggestion of earning money as a wedding photographer and videographer, demanding that I should concentrate only on spiritual things. Later, he registered our association, as he suggested, when we were in Egypt and Peru, as a business venture. We were to name this new company Ethereal Communications. I was unsure what the nature of its operations was going to be. Since he believed that people listened to only successful people, we had to succeed in this supposedly very intently spiritual enterprise by me becoming his personal channeler with the spirit world and his private psychic. The idea turned me off altogether from his dreamt-of business venture. As a human being, let alone as a psychologist, I could not see me performing something like this as a business partner with him, and it did not appeal to me. I believe he was knowledgeable of those so-called psychics who derived a good income by conducting cold reading and calling it spirit communication. He expected me to go into deep trance and let the spirits talk through me, without realizing that my unconscious mind could create stories he wanted to hear, and I would have no recollection of what was being relayed. He declared he did not want to waste time and money on trivial hobbies like videography or photography, even though it was my own funds. Obviously, he did not have any idea that such endeavors related to weddings could be very profitable. So it seemed I dared not do anything else other than spiritual things, having no hobbies, and never apply for any financial assistance when I did not have enough income, because he preferred not to risk having anything to do with the authorities, but I was generously allowed to do paintings, invent mind control devices, and conduct meditation classes for the elite group of his associates. It gave the impression that I was imprisoned against my will, and the whole situation started to look more and more like being sucked into a form of fraternity of an undesirable kind. I will tell you more in a while.